Hi, it's Sidney Hobbs at the Classic Car Museum in St. Augustine, Florida. We're located on US 1 South, just south of downtown. We'd love to host you today, so come on inside. We'll show you around. We've got over 110 cars inside, a lot of memorabilia. We are a nonprofit museum, so we do a lot of things for the community. We run events here. We have an event center that can host your event, and I do store cars for individuals. So with all of that, we have a lot of activities going on. We do a lot of car shows here, a lot of charity events for the community. So come on in. We'll show you around. So you're looking at our showroom. When you enter the museum, there's a lot of things to look at in here. Not only is there a lot of memorabilia, but we have our oldest car in the museum, an 1895 Roche Snyder. Yes, it runs and drives just like everything in the museum. So as you pan around, you'll see everything from gas pumps to a lot of different memorabilia. One of the oldest is a 1930s visible gas pump over here. We also have a 1915 depot hack made by Ford. That was the first Uber, or the first taxi that was ever made out of mostly wood. And then of course we do have some old motorcycles in here, and then again some die cast and a few souvenirs that you can purchase on your way out. Okay, this is our 1895 Roche Snyder. It's the oldest car in the museum, but it's one of the oldest cars in the world. Cars normally were built in the late 1800s. So in 1895, a bicycle maker and a carburetor maker got together and decided they wanted to build a car. Well, as you can see, it looks a lot like a horse and buggy, or a horse buggy way back in the day. They put a motor on it. They hand fabricated this car. Again, it runs and drives. It was built in France. There weren't a lot of cars made. They only made 200 of these from 1895 to 1901. I haven't found another one. But this is a very unique car. It's very sophisticated. It's actually more refined than the Model Ts of the day. A lot of people think Henry Ford invented the car. He didn't. He invented the assembly line to make cars affordable to the masses. But this Roche Snyder has so much work into it and hand built that it's really a piece of art that we're very proud to show in the museum. Now, if you'll notice, the dash is very unique in this car. It does have a pedal and a clutch and an accelerator. It is a 2-speed transmission. It actually has Roche Snyder emblazoned on the dash here. But there's something else in the dashboard. When you raise it up, you'll notice the one gauge that it has, a little bit of a glove compartment, and then the radiator tank is actually under the brass dashboard that's inside the car. Of course, a wood steering wheel, and just a fantastic representation of one of the first automobiles ever made. Now, in 1895, you didn't go really far, you didn't go really fast. This is the gas tank. It's about 1.5 gallons. So when the 1.5 gallons ran out, you had to get more gas, but it was cooler than riding a horse and buggy at the time. Probably not as fast. It ran about 15 miles an hour, but this is the gas tank. It's all brass, and it was about 1.5 gallons of gas. It's all vacuum fed. Okay, that's the sound of a horn in 1915. That horn belongs to this car, which is a 1915 Ford Depot hack. Now, back in the day, Henry Ford started building Model Ts and Model As so that everyone could afford a car, and he invented the assembly line. But all of the cars that he had really didn't provide a need that became apparent when people started traveling further away from home. So they would take the train, come into metropolitan areas, which he and some of his wealthy friends owned the hotels and the restaurants in town, and they really didn't have a way to transport people from the train depot downtown. So Henry basically took a Model T chassis, took it to a wood coach builder. The wood coach builders literally built the rest of the car on top of the chassis. This was a 3-seater back then, so it was the first Uber, it was the first minivan, it was the first taxi, and if you want to know what Depot Hack stands for, it stands for Depot Taxi. So these would run from the train depot down to the metropolitan area and back. So it was a transportation from people from the train depot downtown. Very big part of history. The fact that this car is still intact with pretty much original wood. It does run and drive also, not very often because we have it in our showroom, but it's a huge part of history that Henry Ford saw a need for, and he filled it with a Depot hack. So welcome to the showroom where all of the cars are located. And at the Classic Car Museum in St. Augustine, we have a slogan. We say the cars are the stars, and they certainly are. we have a wide array of different types of cars. We really don't specialize in any one type of cars except they have wheels. That's really the only thing we care about. We've got a lot of Corvettes. That's what I started my collection with 40-something years ago. We have pre-war cars. We have sports cars. We have a lot of different types of cars in the museum. Normally we have about 100 to 110 cars on display at any given time. A lot of rare cars, a couple of movie cars, a lot of sports cars that have some tremendous history, such as the 1969 Dodge Daytona, which I'll share with you in a little more detail in a few minutes. But when you come to the museum, we want you to feel immersed, and we want you to walk down memory lane, and we want you to either remember the times that you used to have a classic car, or if you're dreaming about owning a classic car, we want to make sure that we provide as much information for you to have a great time while you're here. Also, along with these beautiful cars, we have a tremendous amount of memorabilia. Many times the memorabilia will bring back memories. If your family were in the gas station business, or they had a lot of different relationships with the automobile, whether it was the tire industry or the paint industry, we have a lot of memorabilia in here that brings back memories. Plus, it's just fun. Neon lights are fun, and when you look at all of these, the museum is very colorful. When you look around, a lot of the colors from the 40s and the 50s and even the 60s were pretty amazing. So the museum is fun. We had someone tell us a little while ago, they were giving us a recommendation on the way out, and they said, you know, this may be the happiest place on earth. And I said, well, we love that saying, and we feel the same way, but I think a mouse in Orlando already has that slogan trademarked. But we feel like it is one of the happiest places on earth, and we love for you to visit the Classic Car Museum. Now, when you look down the left side of the museum, you see a lot of Corvettes. We actually had one review that said, you have too many Corvettes. Well, I didn't know there was such a thing, but we do love Corvettes, and the reason I have so many is that's what started my collecting over 40 years ago. And actually it started with this red Vet right here. It's a 1961 Chevy Corvette. This belonged to my brother's best friend. And I always dreamed of owning a Corvette when I was a kid, but I never could afford it. But in 1984, my brother called me, and his friend and his wife was adopting a baby, and he had to sell his Corvette. Well, he told me, I know you've wanted a Vet your whole life, you get first dibs. Well, I asked him what he wanted for it. He told me, to me it was $1 million because I didn't have it. I borrowed the money, I bought the car, I started flipping cars to pay for the restoration. It took me 10 years to restore this car. Finally got it to the state that it's in today. I did win a first prize way back when, but this was what started the museum, and it really formulated my love of classic cars, and it showed me a way that I could support my hobby and my habit, if you will. But this one started it all. I get two questions in the museum asked more frequently. What's your favorite car, and what's the most expensive car? By all means, this is my favorite. It started it all. It's very sentimental to me. It will never be sold. It'll be passed down to my daughter and hopefully her kids one day. But this 1961 Corvette is really what started the dream that we now call the Classic Car Museum. Now, I'm standing in front of the most expensive car, the most valuable car in the museum. It's a 1969 Dodge Daytona. And there's a reason that this car is as valuable. First of all, it's untouched and it's an original car. It only has 14,000 original miles. It's never been painted, it's never been touched. But the significance of this car is the history behind it and the amount of information that this car contributed to NASCAR. For example, in 1969, a concept company took a Dodge Charger and they put a nose cone on it, they put a big fin on the back, or a wing on the back, and they took it to Dodge and said, we want to test this car. Well, they got Buddy Baker and Richard Petty to test this car at Talladega Motor Speedway in Alabama. It was the first car to ever run 200 miles an hour on a NASCAR track. Well, of course, Buddy Baker and Richard Petty went to Dodge and said, we want this car. Well, they had a policy, NASCAR back in the day, that a manufacturer had to produce at least 500 cars from their showrooms and sell them to customers before they were allowed to race on a NASCAR track, hence the term stock car. Dodge would not build this car because they did not believe anyone would buy the car, and they were right, by the way. But Petty actually left Plymouth Dodge for a year and went to Ford. Dodge decided then to build the Dodge Daytona. So they built 503 of these just to meet the standard. Richard Petty and Buddy Baker drove the car in 1970 as a Plymouth Superbird. They drove the car over 200 miles an hour. They won over 70% of their races. The car was so fast and it was so unfair that they outlawed the 1970 Plymouth Superbird, and it was no longer allowed to race in NASCAR races. But this car was the big brother of that Superbird. That started it all for NASCAR. First car to ever run 200 miles an hour, and it's the first car that was ever outlawed at NASCAR in 1970. Now, of course, we have the longest car in the museum. We also have the shortest car in the museum. The shortest car in the museum is 1956 Isetta Cabrio bubble top. Very rare car. They only made about 50 of these. The reason being, it has a bubble window on the side. Halfway through the model year, they canceled that and they started putting a sliding window. But this was one of the first ones that was produced with a cabrio and a bubble top. And if you notice it, the door opens from the front. So certainly you wouldn't want to get into any front car collisions with this car, but it's very iconic. It does run and drive. It'll run about 40 or 50 miles an hour, and it qualifies as the shortest and the cutest car in the Classic Car Museum here in St. Augustine. It only weighs about 750 pounds. Now, right behind the Isetta is a carriage. This is an 1895 carriage built in Napoli, Italy. And if you think about the 1895, once again, we had a car in the showroom that's an 1895 Roche Snyder. Well, these were still on the road in 1895, and that puts that car in perspective. Now, this was a very high-end carriage. If you owned one of these back in 1895, you owned a really, really nice carriage. It was considered a clamshell, and what I mean by clamshell is it's all leather, for example, but the top is split in the middle. When you open it up, it lays down like a clamshell. We kind of call it our Princess Di carriage because it looks like a lot of the old English carriages that opened up like a clamshell, but when it was inclement weather, they could always close it up. But it is an absolute amazing representation of what was on the road before cars became prevalent. 1895 carriage built in Napoli, Italy. So on this side of the museum, we have a lot of what we call pre-war cars, which is before 1942, the breakout of World War II. This is a Model A. Right next to the Model A, we have a 1916 Cadillac. Now, back in the day in 1916, if you own this car, you belong to the elite class because it was so sophisticated back in the day. It is a roadster. It's a 7-passenger. This was considered a brass car, obviously because it has a lot of brass on it. But the fact that this car was an 8-cylinder car in 1916 is really a marvel of technology because most of the engines back then were 4-cylinder cars. So if you had one of these back in 1916, you were literally part of the elite in the United States. Right next to it is the 1931 Model A. Now, the significance of this car is my dad was born in 1920. He grew up driving Model A's. He always wanted another one, but he never would buy himself one. So many, many years ago, I had the opportunity to buy this car and give it to my dad for Father's Day. Well, he kept it many, many years. He drove it. It was a really happy day in my life that I was able to give it back to my dad. When he passed away, I got the car back. I did a frame-off restoration. If you notice, it is painted bright red. Henry Ford did not paint Model A's bright red. He painted them usually black. And you could have any color you wanted as long as it was black. Now, they did start making green ones and burgundy ones and gray ones, but I painted this car torch red in honor of my dad because his favorite color was red. Never going to sell this car. It's going to stay in my family forever, but this is a 1931 Model A that I was able to give back to my dad, the love of cars that he instilled in me when I was a young boy. Very significant car in the museum. Next to it is a 1953 ambulance. And this is a real ambulance. It was actually from California, a functioning ambulance, and it's restored to the exact specifications of the way that they used it in 1953. It's on a Chevy drivetrain, a Chevy Suburban drivetrain or panel van, but it is a functioning ambulance. It runs and drives. We have a lot of fun with this, especially around Halloween, letting the kids roam around this car when we turn all the lights on. Some of the other cars we have a 1927 Buick Roadster. One of the unique characteristics about this car is the hood ornament, which you'll notice. Now, these craftsmen took a lot of pride in creating these cars that were very unique. This hood ornament is the Flying Duchess, and it's made out of nickel, and it weighs about 7 or 8 pounds. This hood ornament alone is probably worth $3,000 to $4,000 even if you could find it. This car also had a door in the back that you see open back there, and it was actually a golf club door. Most of the families bought sedans back in 1927 when this car was on the road, but the younger, more affluent playboys of the day would buy a Roadster because it was a sports car. Well, they had to have a place to put their golf clubs. So that door in the back is actually a golf club door. The underbelly of this car is made out of wood, believe it or not. So this car is almost 100 years old. About half of it is wood. It still runs and drives, and it's one of the most magnificent automobiles that we have in the museum.
Wood spokes as well.
Yeah, wood spokes as well, yes. Next to this, the 1938 Packard. The best driving pre-war car that I think was ever made. This car drives like it has power steering, even though they didn't have power steering back in 1938. We use this car for a lot of weddings. When you see this car or the 27 Buick coming down the road at you, you know exactly what kind of car is coming at you. The cars today are all homogenized. You don't know a Kia from a Mercedes sometimes, but these cars, you knew exactly what was coming at you just by the front end. Now, this next car I want to highlight and spend a little bit of time on because this is a 1946 Ford Woody Wagon. You see a surfboard on the top because you can just see this car running up and down PCH Highway in California with a couple of surfboards going to the beach and kids jumping out going surfing. The significant part of this car is it's called a Woody because half the car is made of wood. It's hard to believe that they made cars out of wood back in the 40s, 30s and 40s, and they kind of died out in the late 40s. But the significance that I want to show you as you pan over and look inside of this car is the workmanship that was put into this automobile. Now, if you look up into the headliner of this car, it is all wood. And to get this car to have a curved top with the workmanship that required all of this woodworking, it's truly a piece of artwork that's right before your eyes. So 1946 Ford Woody Wagon, and again, one of the most remarkable cars in the museum because to my knowledge, most of this wood is still original. So it's an 80-year-old car that has a lot of wood on it that to this day looks as good as it did probably in 1946. Okay, so I'm standing in front of a 1976 black Pontiac Trans Am. The significance of this car in the museum is a 76 black Trans Am was my first new car back when I was 17 years old. Now, I begged and begged and begged my dad to co-sign with me to get this car. He reluctantly did so. He loved cars. He just didn't want me to have a fast car when I was 17 years old. But I had 3 jobs in high school to pay for it, and it will always be, next to my red Corvette that you saw earlier, the most memorable car that I've ever owned. Now, the significance in history of this car is that in 1977, a little movie came out called Smokey and the Bandit. It had a black Trans Am in it, but that was in 1977 with Burt Reynolds and Sally Fields. One of the most popular car movies that there's ever been. But what most people don't realize is they filmed the movie in 1976 and they released it in 77. Most of the cars that were in that movie were actually 1976 Trans Ams with these round headlights, as you see, versus the square headlights that actually are on the 1977. But they didn't have enough 1977s, so they knocked the front end off. They put 77 headlights in it. They filmed the movie with the 76 cars, except for the one that you see Burt and Sally in. That was a 1977. They had 2 of those. So that movie was filmed with 1976. Now, the significance for me is when I was in high school, we didn't have a lot of money, but to go to prom or junior, senior, we would go get hamburgers, we'd go to a movie, and then we would go to the prom. Well, as luck would have it, that night the premiere movie was Smokey and the Bandit. I got to pull up in front of the theater in this beautiful black Trans Am, and it was a cool car before that night, but after all of my friends saw that movie, for one night in my life, I was cool. So that's the significance of this car. It's a 1976 black Trans Am. Has some movie history, but it has a lot of personal history for me when I was in high school and the one night that I actually got to be cool. Now, this is a 1957 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz. The interesting thing about this car, they only made 1,800 Eldorado Biarritz cars, but this car is one of 350 because it had air conditioning and it had dual carburetors with a batwing breather. So a very significant car. But what we do with this car here is we put it in front of what we call our Elvis wall. Now, most people know that Elvis loved Cadillacs. Matter of fact, he bought his mother a pink Cadillac, and you see that promoted a lot when you read about Elvis. That was a 1953, 1954 Cadillac. Although this is a 57, we still call it our Elvis Cadillac. We're huge fans of Elvis. He was such a part of the 50s and rock and roll and cars. He owned hundreds of cars in his lifetime. He bought and gave away many, many Cadillacs. So we do provide a tribute to Elvis with all of our memorabilia. We have our Elvis wall that's made up of Elvis albums. Those are actual vinyl album covers that we put on the wall. But we like to put our pink Cadillac here to honor Elvis, and it's really fun. One fun fact about this car that a lot of people don't know, if you notice these front bumpers, they have huge pointed bumpers, or huge pointed apparatus on the front of the bumpers. Now, those were called Dagmars. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but allegedly, the GM designers put those on the car because back in the 50s, there were some buxom actresses that wore very big bustiers, let's just call it. Well, allegedly these designers produced these Dagmars because they reminded male buyers of these beautiful buxom actresses. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. However, they did put these Dagmars on the cars through 1957, 1958, they disappeared. But it's kind of a fun fact that if you look it up, you will read a lot about Dagmars and where they came from. Okay, so I'm standing in front of a 1974 Volkswagen van. Now, back in the day, Volkswagen made a lot of different variations of the van. They made a Vanagon, which was a camper type. They made vans with not many windows. They made vans with a lot of windows. These vans have become so popular that the value of these sometimes now go over $100,000 based on what model of the Volkswagen van. The other cool thing about this van is it appeals to 16-year-olds and to 66-year-olds. It is unbelievable how many decades that the popularity of a Volkswagen or a Volkswagen van specifically will appeal to. Young people love them. Old people love them. People that were hippies in the 60s love them, and everybody in between. One, they're cute. Secondly, they were functioning back in the day. They did a lot of things with these vans that made them very popular when they were selling them out of showrooms. But today, they're probably more popular than they were back when they were sold new in the showrooms. Now, this van has a lot of features. It has an awning that comes out over it. It was built to do some short time camping if you were on the road and you wanted to stop overnight. It has the accommodations that it will make out into a bed inside. You could sleep in the van if you wanted to. You could camp in it, or you could just use it as a passenger van. The curtains inside, you can customize these vans any way that you want to. They're such an iconic part of the American automobile that everybody loves them regardless of the age or gender or socioeconomic class, and they're just fun. So this is a 1974 Volkswagen van. We're located on US 1 South, just south of downtown.